The cottage is the obvious choice for a wedding gift. That's what Giselle said. Flat, certain. The way someone announces where they've already decided dinner will be. She didn't look at me when she said it. She was looking at her phone, actually, thumb scrolling slowly, like what she was proposing required so little effort it didn't even warrant eye contact. You're barely up there anyway. 4 bedrooms for 1 person on the lake. It just doesn't make sense. My brother nodded across the table, slowly. The nod of a man who has already had this conversation in the car on the way over and is now simply presenting the conclusion. My mother's hands came together in her lap. She had that look on her face, the particular soft brightness she gets when she believes something is about to go the way she wants. My father poured himself more wine and studied the table. I was sitting in a restaurant in Bloor West Village on a Saturday evening in October, looking at the 4 people who had watched me work for a decade to build a life I was genuinely proud of, and they were suggesting I hand over the centerpiece of it as a party favor. I picked up my water glass. I took a sip. I set it down. "I'll look into it," I said. Nobody asked what that meant. They assumed it meant what they wanted it to mean. What they didn't know was that I had already called my lawyer 2 days earlier, and that I had absolutely no intent of giving anyone anything. My name is Tara. I'm 31 years old, and I have been a structural engineer since I finished my degree at the University of Waterloo and went directly into a junior position at a firm in downtown Toronto. I was good at the work in the way that happens when the work actually fits the shape of how your brain operates. The precision of it, the fact that a calculation is either correct or it isn't, that the structure either holds or it doesn't. Within 4 years, I had developed enough of a client base to go independent. By 28, I was billing more than I had imagined I would at 35. By 29, I had paid off my Leslieville condo. And by 30, after 3 years of driving up and down Muskoka every weekend I could spare and looking at more properties than I can accurately count, I purchased the place I had been building toward in my head since I was a teenager, reading about cottage country in Ontario like it was a foreign country I intended to visit someday. Sparrow Lake. 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a separate guest cottage at the back of the property that I use as a studio when I work remotely, and a boathouse in better structural shape than half the buildings I've been paid to assess professionally. The main house had been owned by one family for nearly 40 years before I bought it, and you can feel that in the bones of the place. The wide pine floors worn smooth at the thresholds, the stone fireplace in the living room, the kind of solid, considered construction that doesn't happen anymore. I had the kitchen redone the first summer I owned it. White ash cabinetry, soapstone counters, a window above the sink that looks out at the water through birch trees. I chose every detail myself. The purchase price was $3.8 million Canadian. I did not receive help from my parents. I had one contribution from my late grandmother's trust. I'll come back to that, but the vast majority was mine, saved and invested, and chosen deliberately over the better part of a decade. My brother is 6 years older than me and has always moved through the world with a confidence that I spent years admiring before I understood it more clearly. He has charm, real charm, the kind that makes people want to do things for him. He did a business degree, worked at a consultancy for a few years, decided he preferred independence, and has been doing intermittent consulting work ever since. He has never owned property. He has never particularly seemed bothered by this, which I used to think was admirable and now understand as something else. He is also, undeniably, the favored child in our family, not in any dramatic declared way, but in the quiet, cumulative way that shapes everything without anyone ever saying it out loud. My parents have spent 38 years treating his preferences as weather conditions to be accommodated, and my preferences as negotiating positions. When he announced his engagement to Giselle at Thanksgiving, I was genuinely happy for them. Giselle is sharp and direct and gets things done, and she had clearly organized my brother's life in ways that benefited him. I liked her well enough. I just hadn't yet understood how thoroughly she had surveyed the family's assets and what conclusions she had reached. The October dinner was supposed to be a celebration. Engagement planning, restaurant wine, excited family conversation. I arrived early. I bought them a bottle of something sparkling. I dressed up a little. By the time Giselle brought up the cottage, we had barely worked through the bread. She laid it out with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed. The wedding reception could be held on the property. The back lawn was exactly the right size. The guest cottage would become a home office for my brother once he scaled back his consulting hours. The dock needed replacing, which they'd handle. The exterior would need repainting, probably something lighter. She spoke about my home in the future tense throughout, as though the transfer had already occurred and we were just catching up on the administrative details. My brother added, helpfully, that I was so busy with work anyway, that the property probably sat empty for months at a stretch. I had been up to the cottage 4 times in September alone. My mother leaned toward me across the table. It would mean so much, Tara. You can always find another place. They need the space. They're starting a family. They were engaged. Giselle was not pregnant. I had learned long ago not to correct these preemptive narrative additions. My father finally spoke. It's the practical thing, he said, in the tone he reserves for things he'd rather not be involved in, but also doesn't want to miss. You're sensible. You understand these things. I looked at all 4 of them. I took a breath. I'll look into it, I said. Let me speak to my lawyer and we can all meet properly to go over the paperwork. My mother squeezed my hand. Giselle went back to her phone. My brother refilled his glass. Nobody looked at me like a person who had just agreed to give away her most valuable asset with suspiciously little resistance. What I didn't say, what I had no intention of saying, was that I had already spoken to my lawyer. I had called Ms. Drummond the Thursday before. The morning after my mother had raised the idea in a phone call she framed as a casual thought. My mother has never had a casual thought in her life, and I had recognized the shape of that conversation immediately. I called Ms. Drummond. I explained what was coming. She asked me 4 very specific questions, put me on hold, and came back saying she needed to pull the Hargrove Trust documents. My grandmother, Ruth Hargrove, died in the spring of 2019. She was 80 years old and had lived her entire life in Hamilton, and she was one of those small, quiet women who notice everything and choose very deliberately what to say out loud about it. She made butter tarts that people drove across the city for. She had been married for 51 years to a man who thought she was the most capable person he'd ever met. And he was right. When she died, she left behind an estate that was modest by most measures and an irrevocable trust that, as it turned out, was the most precisely designed document I had ever seen. The trust had contributed $150,000 toward the Sparrow Lake purchase. Meaningful, but not the bulk of what I paid. I had read the trust agreement when I signed and then filed it away, the way you file legal documents you expect never to need. I had not read Section 9, Paragraph 3, with any particular attention. Ms. Drummond read it to me over the phone. I sat at my kitchen table and listened. When she finished, I said, "They're going to do this, aren't they?" "It sounds very much like it," she said. "What do I need to do?" "Document everything from this point forward," she said, "and let them proceed." I recorded the rest of that phone call with my mother. Then I called Ms. Drummond back and sent her the file. The meeting was set for a Thursday morning, Bay Street, 32nd floor. I arrived early and had coffee by the windows, looking out over Lake Ontario, gray and wide and completely indifferent to whatever was about to happen in the conference room behind me, which I found oddly comforting. My brother and Giselle arrived 11 minutes late. My parents 2 minutes after that. They had driven down together, which told me everything about how they expected the morning to go. There was a choreography to how they arranged themselves around the walnut table. My brother and Giselle, across from me, my parents flanking, that had the feel of something planned. Giselle put a folder on the table before Ms. Drummond had fully sat down. It contained printed pages. I could see the format from across the table. Contractor estimates, with photographs. "We've had 2 companies look at the dock," she said, spreading pages out. "We're going with composite decking, something that'll actually last. The boathouse is structurally fine, we're keeping it." She glanced at me briefly. "The guest cottage will convert. Probably a home gym for Fletcher. Maybe a proper media room in the back half. Nothing load-bearing. The guest cottage is where I work. I have a standing desk, 3 monitors, a whiteboard the length of one wall, and a garden view I designed myself." But Giselle was already moving on to paint colors. My father uncapped his pen and turned to Ms. Drummond. "Let's get to it. We have a lunch booking after this. Just tell us where Tara signs for the transfer." Ms. Drummond folded her hands on the table. She has a stillness that I have always found remarkable. Not coldness, just an absolute absence of fidgeting or hurry. Rooms tend to quiet down around her without quite knowing why. "Before we get to any documentation," she said, "there's a matter that directly affects the title. It won't take long, but it needs to be addressed first." She opened her file and withdrew a document bound in dark green. She placed it at the center of the table with the careful deliberateness of someone setting down something that matters. "When Tara purchased the Sparrow Lake property 3 years ago," she began, "a portion of the acquisition was structured through the Hargrove Family Trust, established by Tara's late maternal grandmother, Ruth Hargrove. The trust is irrevocable and its terms have legal standing with respect to any property acquired under its scope." She opened the document to a page marked with a yellow tab. "I'll read Section 9, Paragraph 3 directly." She adjusted her glasses. "In the event that any direct family member of the primary beneficiary, including but not limited to siblings, parents, or their spouses, initiates, encourages, or applies sustained pressure toward the non-voluntary transfer of the beneficiary's primary residential holding, an automatic reversion mechanism is engaged. This mechanism suspends all secondary trust distributions pending full independent audit. Secondary distributions include monthly stipend payments to any named secondary beneficiaries, as well as any designated inheritance allocations to direct siblings of the primary beneficiary, effective immediately upon verified triggering event." She set the document down. The room was completely quiet. "What does that mean, exactly?" my brother said. His voice had changed. Not loud, just careful. The way you speak when you're not sure yet what you're walking toward. It means," Miss Drummond said, "that if a family member pressures Tara to transfer this property, the trust's secondary allocations are suspended immediately. Those include the monthly distribution your parents receive since the estate settled, approximately $4,000 per month, and your designated inheritance allocation, which stands at $1.4 million and was scheduled to transfer to you at age 40. She looked at him steadily. "That allocation does not transfer. It redirects to the Hargrove Community Fund, as specified by your grandmother." Nothing moved in the room. My father put the pen down very slowly. He pulled the document toward him and read the highlighted section. Once, then again. The red in his face went through several gradations and ended somewhere pale. My mother made a small sound. Giselle was very still. She was looking at my brother with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before. Not anger, something quieter and more calculating. She was doing arithmetic. "When was the triggering event?" my brother said. "October 21st, Ms. Drummond said. "Tara provided me with a recording of her phone call with her mother that morning, along with written documentation of 2 subsequent conversations. The clause was triggered and logged on that date. This morning's meeting, as a continuation of the pressure campaign, is also documented." My mother turned to me. Her eyes were wet. "Tara, please, it was just a family discussion. We weren't forcing you. You know we weren't forcing you. Tell her it was just talking." "Mum," I said, as gently as I could manage. "You called a family meeting and had someone bring contractor quotes." I looked at Giselle's folder, spread out across the conference table. "I said no at dinner. Clearly. And you called me again 2 days later to try a second time. I have both conversations recorded." Her hands went to her lap. Giselle stood up. She did it with the particular economy of motion, of someone who has already made a decision their body is moving ahead of. She gathered her renovation folder. She put on her coat. She looked at my brother for a moment. Something passed between them that I didn't try to read. And then she walked out of the conference room without saying anything to anyone. My brother sat in his chair for another 10 minutes. He asked Ms. Drummond whether the clause could be appealed. She said not within the terms of this trust. He asked whether I could voluntarily override it. She said my grandmother had specifically structured it to prevent that. That the clause was designed to protect me even from myself in a moment of family pressure, and that this had been explicitly discussed with her estate solicitor over multiple meetings. He asked whether the audit timeline could be expedited. She said she could look into it, but that the community fund redirection would proceed regardless of timeline, if coercive intent was confirmed by the audit, which she believed it would be. He looked at me then. Really looked, for the first time that morning, like I was a person in the room rather than an obstacle between him and a resolution. "She knew," he said. He meant my grandmother. It wasn't an accusation. It was something closer to wonder. "She knew," I said. He nodded once. He stood up. He left. My parents stayed another 20 minutes. My father attempted a few more angles, something about undue influence, something about the trust being outdated, and Ms. Drummond answered each one with the same quiet completeness until he stopped. My mother had stopped crying. She sat looking at the table with the expression of a person reconstructing something that has just broken. I stood up. I thanked Ms. Drummond. I told my parents I would be in touch. And then I walked out of that office into a Thursday in November gray sky, the wind coming off the lake with the particular cold. That means winter is close, and I stood on the sidewalk on Bay Street and just breathed it for a moment. Then I walked 3 blocks to the cafe I like and ordered a flat white and a slice of whatever was in the pastry case and sat in the window and watched the city and felt for the first time in weeks like I had enough space in my chest to actually breathe. It has been 7 months. The engagement is off. Giselle ended it 6 weeks after the Bay Street meeting. My mother reported this to me in a voicemail that somehow managed to point the geography of blame in my general direction, which I thought was impressive given the circumstances. My brother spent 2 months back in my parents' house in North York before finding a rental in Hamilton. We talk sometimes. Not the way we did when we were young, but we talk. Something cracked open in October that hasn't closed, and I don't know if it will, and I've been working on being at peace with not knowing. My parents lost the monthly trust distributions while the audit runs. I know it has changed things for them in practical ways. I know, too, that my grandmother understood exactly what those consequences would look like when she structured this clause, and that she chose it anyway. She spent 6 months in meetings with her estate solicitor over this document. She revised it 3 times. She was a woman who did not make careless decisions. I drove up to Sparrow Lake the first weekend in June. The lake was that pale silver gray it gets in early summer mornings before the heat settles in, and the birch trees along the shoreline still had that new leaf translucence that only lasts a couple of weeks. I made coffee in the kitchen, the white ash kitchen I chose myself, and took it out to the dock and sat there for a long time before I opened my laptop. A pair of loons worked the far end of the bay, their calls carrying across the water in that way that makes the lake feel much larger than it is. My grandmother left me a letter. Ms. Drummond handed it to me after the Bay Street meeting in a sealed envelope. Just my name on the outside, in the handwriting I'd known since I was small enough to sit in her kitchen and watch her roll pastry. I couldn't open it for weeks. I finally read it on that dock in June, with my coffee going cold beside me. She didn't write much. She was not a woman who wrote much. I have watched you build everything you have without anyone's help, and I have watched certain people in this family treat that as an invitation. I want you to know that I saw it clearly, even when I didn't say so. This is my way of saying so now, in the only language they will hear. Look after yourself, my girl. Look after the lake. I folded it back along the original creases. I keep it in the cedar chest in the bedroom. The one with the good view of the water. I take it out sometimes when I need to remember that someone saw me clearly, even in the years when other people found it more convenient not to. The dock is still weathered pine. I never replaced it. I've thought often, since all of this, about whether I should have handled it differently. Whether I should have said no more loudly at that dinner table, put my foot down, made a scene, forced the conversation into the open right then. And I keep coming back to the same answer. I did say no. I said it plainly. They rescheduled a contractor meeting anyway. There was no version of that dinner where saying no more emphatically would have changed the outcome. Because the outcome they had planned didn't include a version of no. The only language available to me in that situation was the one my grandmother had already written. She understood that before I did. She prepared it 20 years before it was needed. And she did it quietly, without telling anyone, without making it dramatic, without ever once suggesting to me or anyone else that she had seen exactly what was coming. Every morning I wake up at the lake, I think about that. About the particular kind of love that looks like paperwork. About how sometimes the most powerful thing someone does for you is something you don't find out about until they're gone. The cottage is mine, the lake is still, and I am exactly where I am supposed to be. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever had someone in your family look at something you built from nothing and quietly decide it was theirs to claim, I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me your story, or just tell me where in Canada you're watching from. I'm always curious how far these things reach. And if you want to stay for more, the subscribe button is right there.